Did Senator Adam Schiff just consciously and deliberately walk into a meticulously laid, catastrophic political trap explicitly designed to permanently end his decades-long career in Washington? Or did FBI Director Kash Patel just permanently, voluntarily, and violently detonate his own professional legacy on live, globally broadcast television? The monumental question did not merely echo, it actively and aggressively tore across the vast, oppressive, heavily wood-paneled expanse of the Senate Judiciary Committee room. It cut through the dense, highly pressurized, culturally toxic, and historically heavy atmosphere of the Grand Chamber like a precisely thrown, razor-sharp steel blade meant to draw immediate, highly visible political blood. Are you genuinely trying to tell the American people, Director, that the infamous, highly guarded client list of Jeffrey Epstein mysteriously contained absolutely no other names besides Jeffrey Epstein himself? The devastating inquiry physically traveled from the elevated, imposing mahogany dais where the senators sat, positioned like untouchable modern-day Roman tribunes, looking down upon the marble floor. It bypassed the frantic tapping shorthand of the official stenographer, reached the absolute back wall of the cavernous, historically rich hearing room, and rebounded sharply against the cold marble pillars. It left a heavy, suffocating, almost unbearable tension in its terrifying wake. Every single live microphone in the sprawling room seemed to instantly amplify the hostility, transforming the very air into a thick, unbreathable electric static that pressed down on the chests of everyone present. There was absolutely no immediate, comfortable silence following the massive, world-stopping accusation. Instead, there was a sudden, collective, desperate holding of breath from the 200 tightly packed individuals sitting shoulder to shoulder in the public gallery. Young congressional aides abruptly stopped typing on their glowing mobile devices, their thumbs freezing over the glass screens. Heavily armed, stoic security details subtly shifted their weight, their hands resting near their belts, anticipating a physical disruption. Sitting precisely at the center witness table, entirely exposed and directly in the unforgiving, unblinking crosshairs of dozens of high-definition television cameras and the intense, predatory scrutiny of the National Press Corps, was FBI Director Kash Patel. He did not freeze in sudden panic. He did not nervously look down at his perfectly aligned yellow legal pad, seeking last-minute guidance from his sprawling team of highly paid, visibly nervous attorneys sitting directly behind him. Instead, his jaw visibly tightened, the heavy, dense muscles flexing rhythmically under his skin in a clear display of restrained fury. His broad shoulders came forward aggressively, deliberately closing the physical distance between himself and the powerful oversight committee as he leaned heavily into the thin black stem of his desktop microphone. He radiated the unyielding, highly combustible, and deeply unpredictable energy of a political street fighter who fundamentally despises the traditional, polite, unwritten rules of congressional engagement. He looked exactly like a man who had not come to peacefully testify, but had come entirely prepared to burn the historic building down to its very foundation, regardless of who was trapped inside. This was the ultimate, completely inevitable collision of two fundamentally incompatible political universes colliding in real time under the brightest, most unforgiving lights in Washington, D.C. On one elevated side of the Grand Room was Adam Schiff. He is a man who meticulously constructs complex, multi-layered rhetorical traps over months of quiet, calculating planning. Schiff demands surgical, mathematical precision in every single spoken syllable. He speaks with the chilling, measured, entirely emotionless cadence of a seasoned, ruthless prosecutor who truly believes he has already locked every single exit door in the building before he even asks his first question. On the opposite side, down in the proverbial arena, was Patel. He is a combative, highly disruptive institutional force entirely prepared to flip the entire metaphorical table upside down rather than quietly play a rigged, highly predictable game of bureaucratic chess. 14 separate, highly specialized broadcast cameras maintained a tight, incredibly unforgiving focus on their faces. They were continuously broadcasting every minute micro expression, every tightened lip, every flared nostril, and every condescending blink to millions of glowing digital screens across the globe. Down in the designated press section, a veteran political reporter's fingers hovered completely frozen over a silver laptop keyboard. They were suspended in the agonizing, terrifying hesitation of a seasoned professional deciding whether the highly critical, career-defining sentence they were about to type would actually survive the devastating, unpredictable political fallout of tomorrow morning's news cycle. The confrontation did not immediately erupt into raw, unadulterated chaos. Instead, it built its terrifying momentum systematically, piece by agonizing piece, like a grandmaster slowly suffocating an opponent. It deliberately layered numbers, administrative accusations, and complex, labyrinthine bureaucratic maneuvers to slowly, methodically trap the prey. Schiff smoothly and deliberately shifted the gravitational center of the interrogation. He moved smoothly away from the spectacular tabloid-ready headlines regarding the missing human trafficking list and plunged his surgical scalpel directly into the internal, highly classified, heavily guarded daily operations of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He reached out with pale, perfectly steady hands and coldly flipped open a tremendously thick black institutional binder. The crisp, sharp, deeply satisfying sound of heavy stock paper turning over was caught perfectly by the highly sensitive audio equipment and broadcasted directly into the violently silent room. He demanded absolute, unequivocal, heavily documented answers regarding the sudden, unprecedented, and highly controversial termination of numerous high-ranking, deeply experienced federal agents over the past 6 tumultuous months. Schiff framed the complex, multi-tiered inquiry with deliberate, carefully calculated malice. His voice dropped half an octave to emphasize the terrifying gravity of his federal accusation. He asked, looking directly over the top rim of his designer reading glasses, if Patel had systematically and vindictively purged these specific senior officials from the Bureau simply because they had previously been assigned to investigate the former president during a highly contentious, incredibly divisive election cycle. The insinuation was massive. It was incredibly dangerous and heavily weighted with terrifying foundational constitutional implications. It was explicitly, undeniably designed to paint a devastating public picture of an American justice system being actively dismantled, utterly corrupted, and lethally weaponized from the inside out for pure, unadulterated political retribution and petty, vindictive personal vengeance. Patel fired back instantly. He completely and disrespectfully ignored the unwritten sacred rules of giving a sitting United States senator a respectful, deferential pause. His voice projected so loudly and forcefully from his deep chest that it caused the audio levels to briefly peak and distort into a harsh digital screech on the live broadcast feed. There were absolutely no terminations executed for political reasons, Senator. He flatly and aggressively rejected the core premise. He stated with absolute, concrete, unshakable certainty that the senator's narrative was a complete, malicious, entirely fabricated media delusion designed specifically to drive cable news ratings. The individuals removed from their powerful, deeply entrusted positions were terminated safely, legally, and permanently because they had fundamentally failed to uphold their sworn constitutional oaths to this office and to the American public. They broke the sacred public trust, they violated the core operational guidelines of the Bureau, and I removed them to actively protect the foundational integrity of the institution. Schiff, never missing a single beat and entirely unfazed by the aggressively rising volume of the hostile witness, immediately pressed harder. He sharply accelerated the underlying rhythm of the interrogation to a punishing, almost physically exhausting degree. So you are officially testifying under penalty of perjury right here, right now, in front of this entire oversight committee and the watching nation that the 3 separate, highly decorated senior officials currently filing massive federal lawsuits against your agency are all entirely fabricating their claims out of thin air? Is that your official sworn testimony to the United States Senate today? Because the permanent congressional record will reflect your exact words, Director, and I assure you there will be severe, lasting legal consequences if those words are proven false. The pacing of the highly televised exchange reached a blistering, unrelenting, entirely overwhelming speed. It transformed rapidly from a formal, polite congressional inquiry into a rapid-fire, brutal verbal combat. Neither man allowed the other to properly finish a complete thought, offer a nuanced explanation, or even take a natural, calming breath. The very air in the room felt as though it was actively vibrating with pure, unmasked hostility. Without allowing the crushing, heavy tension regarding the terminated federal agents to settle for even a fraction of a second, Schiff violently pivoted the timeline and the core subject matter yet again. He moved rapidly toward a dark, sinister shadow that has heavily haunted the American justice system, the mainstream media, and the collective public consciousness for several long, agonizing years. He deliberately brought up the highly controversial, universally questioned, and shockingly sudden transfer of Ghislaine Maxwell. She was the notorious, federally convicted enabler and chief architect of the horrific, sprawling Epstein international human trafficking ring. Schiff laid out a stark, deeply uncomfortable, and highly specific timeline for the official congressional record. He pointed out, using meticulously researched dates, times, and classified federal flight logs, that shortly after the new administration took executive control of the federal government, this incredibly high-profile, deeply connected, and uniquely dangerous inmate was mysteriously relocated. She was moved in the dead of night from a heavily fortified, deeply monitored maximum security facility located in a metropolitan center directly to a remote federal prison camp. This new, highly questionable facility possessed significantly lower security protocols, vastly reduced surveillance camera systems, and incredibly lenient administrative oversight that allowed privileged prisoners almost unimaginable daily freedoms. How do you explain this miraculous bureaucratic coincidence, Director? Schiff asked rapidly. His eyes narrowed to small, dark, unforgiving slits behind his expensive glasses. Are we to honestly believe, against all available human logic, that the most high-profile, legally vulnerable, and politically dangerous prisoner in the entire federal justice system was simply downgraded by a random computer algorithm on your watch? Are you actively suggesting that a woman who holds the darkest, most terrifying secrets of the global elite simply slipped through an administrative crack in the very department you are solemnly sworn to oversee? The room began to noticeably heat up. The physical temperature was seemingly rising in direct correlation with the exponentially escalating hostility between the two men. The rhythm of the hearing was no longer a structured, respectful question and answer session governed by strict parliamentary procedure. It had fully and irreversibly devolved into a series of sharp, hostile, and aggressively overlapping interruptions. The panicked official stenographer was visibly sweating, her hands flying across her specialized keyboard, struggling desperately to capture the chaotic, colliding dialogue for the permanent historical record. When Patel forcefully deflected the massive, highly dangerous accusation, stating firmly and legally that the Federal Bureau of Prisons operates as a completely independent, standalone administrative entity that makes its own housing decisions entirely without the operational interference, structural guidance, or prior knowledge of the FBI or the broader Department of Justice, Schiff did something entirely unexpected. He changed his combat tactics entirely. He stopped talking. The stopping was incredibly abrupt, deeply jarring, and intensely physically uncomfortable for everyone watching. It closely resembled a speeding, massive, multi-ton freight train violently slamming on its emergency brakes on a wet, dangerous highway, sending bright orange sparks flying into the pitch-black night. Everything leading up to this exact, highly calculated moment had moved at a blistering, unrelenting, physically exhausting debate speed. It was a rapid-fire exchange of heavy political artillery. But this was one person deliberately, consciously choosing to stop the forward momentum entirely, and the choosing was intensely, painfully audible to every single living person present in the room. Schiff stilled his hands completely. He rested them perfectly flat and parallel on his highly polished wooden desk, the pale skin of his knuckles contrasting sharply with the dark, rich wood. He tilted his head slightly down, deliberately peering over the top rim of his reading glasses. He looked directly down at the witness table with an expression of manufactured, profound, and deeply theatrical disappointment. He looked at Patel not as a political equal, but as a deeply disappointing, misbehaving child who had just told an incredibly obvious, easily disprovable lie. The auditorium's massive industrial-grade ventilation system cycled with a low mechanical exhale. It pushed heavily conditioned air through the complex aluminum ductwork hidden securely above the acoustic ceiling tiles. It emerged as a steady, droning, monotonous hum that the 200 attendees packed into the gallery had not even noticed until this very exact moment. They had not noticed it simply because there had always been loud, combative, argumentative human voices actively covering it up. There were absolutely no human voices covering it now. A heavy antique wooden chair creaked loudly under shifting, deeply uncomfortable weight in the second row of the public seating. Someone nervously cleared their throat, the sound echoing like a gunshot in a canyon. The designated television camera operator, standing exactly 5 feet from Patel's witness table, had his index finger resting securely on the mechanical zoom ring. He was actively sweating under the heavy studio lights, but consciously choosing not to turn the ring a single millimeter, absolutely terrified of ruining the perfect, silent, incredibly tense broadcast shot that his frantic producer was currently screaming about in his earpiece. Schiff slowly, methodically, and deliberately utilized a rhetorical weapon perfectly designed to completely neutralize his opponent's defense. He achieved this by appealing directly, emotionally, and heavily condescendingly to the raw intelligence of the viewing public. Do you genuinely expect the hardworking, tax-paying American citizens watching at home right now to actually believe that completely absurd, insultingly paper-thin administrative explanation, Mr. Patel? Schiff asked. His voice was suddenly very quiet, dropping almost to a menacing theatrical whisper that forced everyone in the large room to physically lean forward just to hear him. He spoke slowly and distinctly, ensuring every single agonizing syllable landed with maximum gravity and profound, devastating condescension. Do you truly believe deep in your heart that the American people are that profoundly naive, that easily manipulated by bureaucratic doublespeak, and that remarkably stupid? It was a highly calculated, utterly devastating psychological maneuver intended to permanently corner Patel in front of the entire nation. By explicitly framing Patel's dry, bureaucratic, highly legalistic answer as a direct, highly insulting assault on the collective intelligence of the entire American populace, Schiff had effectively stated that any further denial from the director would not just be a standard political lie to an oversight committee, it would be framed instantly as a malicious, arrogant, elitist deception aimed directly at the innocent voters themselves. It was the exact kind of high-minded, pretentious, inescapable verbal trap that highly educated career politicians utilize to force their less experienced, rougher rivals into embarrassing, stuttering, and deeply damaging public apologies. It was designed to force absolute submission. However, unlike traditional, heavily polished, focus group-tested politicians who might instinctively attempt to carefully weave their way out of such a tightly constructed, highly dangerous narrative trap with measured, heavily legally reviewed language, Kash Patel consciously and aggressively chose to detonate it. The absolute last remaining shred of institutional restraint, professional decorum, and basic political politeness completely and totally evaporated from the historic Senate chamber in a fraction of a second. Patel's heavy right hand slammed down incredibly hard against the solid wooden witness table. It generated a sharp, sudden, highly violent physical crack that the live audio system instantly picked up, amplified, and broadcasted to millions of startled, shocked living rooms across the entire country. The ice water inside his glass rocked back and forth violently. It splashed slightly over the crystal rim and onto his meticulously typed legal documents, the dark ink instantly blurring beneath the droplets. The water continued to shake long after his angry, trembling fingers left the table. He completely abandoned his formal, submissive, defensive posture. He completely ignored his frantic, terrified legal counsel sitting right behind him, who was desperately trying to pull on the back of his suit jacket to calm him down. Patel launched a blistering, deeply personal, heavily emotional, entirely unscripted counteroffensive directly at the powerful senator. His voice rose dramatically in volume and raw, unfiltered intensity. He instantly dominated the entire acoustic space of the grand room, effectively shutting down any attempt at interruption from the dais through sheer brute vocal force. No, Senator, I actually think the American people are incredibly smart, and I believe they are absolutely starving, actively begging for the undisputed truth. Patel shouted, his voice tearing completely through the formal, quiet, historically respectful decorum of the hearing like a chainsaw through rotting wood. And the absolute, undeniable, historically documented truth is that my agency and the American public have undeniable, highly public proof of your endless, exhausting, pathological history of deliberate political fabrications. From the very beginning of the Russian collusion hoax that paralyzed this entire nation for years, all the way to the highly selective, maliciously dishonest editing of the January 6th security tapes that you completely manipulated to serve your own sick, twisted political narrative. Schiff's mouth opened to immediately cut him off. His hand aggressively reached for his own red microphone button to silence the witness and restore his absolute dominance over the room, but Patel had entirely seized the momentum. He had completely occupied the physical, auditory, and psychological space of the room, leaving no oxygen for anyone else to breathe. Patel did not stop. He escalated the language to a hostile, incredibly personal, borderline, legally actionable level rarely witnessed in the long, dignified, and carefully managed 200-year history of formal Senate proceedings. He stood up slightly, his heavy wooden chair scraping loudly against the floor behind him. He pointed a rigid, accusatory finger directly at the elevated dais, aiming it precisely at the center of Schiff's chest, ensuring every single broadcast camera caught the aggressive, deeply hostile, physical gesture. You are, without a single doubt in my mind, the most spectacular, destructive, absolutely deceitful political charlatan to ever occupy a seat in the United States Senate. You are a profound, lasting disgrace to this legislative body, a man entirely devoid of institutional courage, basic human honesty, and moral integrity. Patel was breathing heavily now, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. His face was flushed with genuine, unfiltered anger, the veins standing out visibly on his neck. But he pushed forward aggressively, driving the final devastating nail into the confrontation before the panicked chairman could physically summon the armed guards or stop the microphone feed. He dropped the ultimate, devastating, highly viral insult directly onto the permanent, historical congressional record. At the absolute best, Senator Schiff, you are nothing more than a desperate, attention-seeking, completely unhinged political buffoon. The grand historic Senate chamber instantly descended into pure, unadulterated, screaming chaos. The packed public gallery erupted into a fractured, deafening chorus of shocked, high-pitched gasps. There were incredibly loud, fiercely supportive cheers from partisan supporters sitting in the back rows, jumping to their feet in defiance. There was outraged, angry, desperate shouting from the various committee staff members attempting to physically restore order. The presiding chairman frantically grabbed his heavy wooden gavel, hammering it down with rapid, violent, percussive strikes that echoed sharply off the marble walls like rapid gunfire. Order! I demand order in this committee. The witness will suspend, he shouted into his microphone, his face turning bright red. But the sound of the banging wood and his desperate shouting entirely failed to restore any semblance of control to the hopelessly compromised, out-of-control room. The dam had officially, irreparably broken. yet perfectly captured by the highly precise, focused, directional audio equipment cutting directly through the overwhelming, deafening noise of the chaotic crowd. Schiff managed to lean intimately close to his microphone and deliver his own venomous, highly calculating parting shot. With a voice completely devoid of any elevated emotion, dripping entirely with absolute, freezing, surgical, terrifying contempt, Schiff fired back perfectly into the live television feed. His eyes never left Patel's flushed, angry face for a single second. And you, director, are behaving exactly like nothing more than an unhinged, emotionally unstable, desperately sad internet troll. The immediate, chaotic, utterly explosive aftermath of the spectacular, highly unprecedented collision did not involve any deep, meaningful, or historically significant reflection on the terrifying existential and deeply systemic issues that had actually been raised during the intense proceeding. There was absolutely no serious, thoughtful national conversation about the compromised integrity of federal law enforcement investigations. There were no roundtable discussions about the suspiciously opaque handling of high-profile, incredibly dangerous human trafficking inmates. There was no deep dive into the incredibly dangerous, ongoing, deeply toxic politicization of the American Justice Department. Instead, the resulting political fallout was a massive, instantaneous, highly toxic digital shockwave. It completely and totally consumed the modern, fast-paced, algorithmic media ecosystem like a raging, uncontrollable, windswept California wildfire, destroying absolutely everything in its path. Within a mere 2 hours of the final desperate gavel falling to officially adjourn the disastrous, completely embarrassing hearing, the explosive shouting video clips had been meticulously ripped and downloaded. They were edited in dark rooms by unseen digital strategists, completely stripped of any boring, nuanced legislative context or essential background information. They were heavily and aggressively deployed across every single major social media platform on the internet. The exact phrases "biggest fraud," "political charlatan," and "political buffoon" immediately dominated global trending algorithms. The short, violent clips racked up a staggering 12 million views across various platforms before the traditional evening network news broadcasts had even properly begun to air on the East Coast. The major highly partisan cable television networks gleefully divided their massive high-definition broadcast screens in half. They played the spectacular, screaming, shouting match on an endless, hypnotic, highly addictive, constantly repeating visual loop. Meanwhile, highly paid, heavily made up, loudly shouting pundits aggressively argued over who formally won the emotional exchange. They treated a profound crisis of national security and institutional integrity like a professional wrestling match, scoring points for volume and cruelty rather than substance and objective truth. Highly funded political action committees on both sides of the fierce, unbridgeable ideological spectrum aggressively seized the incredibly profitable, deeply polarizing moment. Millions of automated, desperate, highly emotional, fear-mongering, fundraising emails flooded personal digital inboxes across the entire country within hours of the fiery exchange. Teams of copywriters rapidly A/B tested different subject lines to maximize the financial harvest of the nation's collective anger. One political faction aggressively, blindly celebrated the fearless outsider director. They praised him as a working-class hero who finally possessed the raw courage and absolute audacity to publicly humiliate a corrupt, entrenched, elitist establishment figure straight to his face on national television. They framed his complete lack of decorum as a necessary, patriotic act of righteous rebellion against a broken, tyrannical system. Meanwhile, the opposing side frantically and desperately begged their loyal, terrified base for immediate, massive financial donations of $5, $10, or $50. They claimed the money was needed right this second to rapidly protect the sacred, vulnerable, deeply threatened institutions of American democracy from a rogue, dangerous, completely out of control executive branch and its hostile, thuggish enforcers. They framed Schiff as the last remaining bastion of intellectual defense against a rising, dangerous tide of authoritarian anti-intellectualism. The profound, deeply concerning, and highly complex substance of the 3-hour hearing, the missing names on the darkest list in the world, the fired federal agents, the compromised prison security was entirely incinerated in the blast furnace of the modern culture war. It left behind absolutely nothing but the highly lucrative, easily monetizable, deeply divisive, utterly useless ashes of manufactured partisan outrage. The specific phrase internet troll appeared prominently printed on cheap novelty campaign t-shirts, oversized coffee mugs, and bumper stickers by the very next morning. It perfectly, tragically demonstrated exactly how a profound, terrifying crisis of American justice is instantly transformed into cheap, disposable political merchandise to be sold to an enraged, permanently distracted public. Thousands of miles away from the echoing, grand, marble-lined halls of Washington, D.C., and light years away from the lucrative, brightly lit television studios in New York, in an incredibly quiet, dimly lit, completely unassuming suburban living room, the terrifying reality of the situation landed with a devastating, silent, completely crushing, agonizing weight. Virginia Giuffre, a brave, deeply scarred, remarkably resilient woman whose entire life had been permanently fractured and forever altered by the very trafficking network they had so casually used as a cheap political talking point, sat completely motionless on her faded, comfortable living room sofa. Her aching back was pressed hard against the soft fabric cushions. Her tired, deeply expressive, incredibly weary eyes were fixed securely on the glowing, bright screen of her laptop resting on the scratched wooden coffee table in front of her. The incredibly viral, highly edited video of the director of the FBI and a powerful United States senator actively trading vicious, immature high school insults played out in vibrant, highly saturated colors. The bright screen cast flickering, ghostly, rapidly moving shadows across her exhausted, pale face. Outside her window, the quiet suburban night was completely still. The crickets chirped softly in the warm summer air, offering absolutely no comfort to the dark, churning, intensely painful storm brewing inside her mind. She deliberately kept the laptop volume remarkably low, completely isolating the visual spectacle of the event. She watched two incredibly powerful men actively weaponize her deeply personal, unimaginable trauma. They were using the absolute worst, most degrading moments of her entire existence simply for their own immediate political survival, campaign fundraising, and cheap public glorification. They had casually, almost thoughtlessly invoked the dark, terrifying name of her monster, the man who had systematically stolen her innocence and the innocence of so many others. They had recklessly and cynically weaponized the terrifying, still hidden, highly protected list of powerful, incredibly wealthy individuals who had actively participated in legally protected and heavily funded the total, systematic destruction of countless young, completely innocent lives. Those missing names, securely locked away in impenetrable, climate-controlled, classified federal vaults, buried under miles of bureaucratic red tape, and completely blacked out by thick, heavy strokes of dark ink and heavily redacted court documents, were not merely abstract concepts. They were fiercely and aggressively protected by sprawling, multi-million-dollar armies of ruthless corporate lawyers who billed by the hour specifically to ensure that the darkest secrets of the global elite never saw the harsh light of public day. To the powerful men screaming on the television, those missing names were not human beings, and they were certainly not predators to be brought to justice. They were simply convenient political leverage. They were highly effective debate points to be scored in a grand televised game of partisan chess. But to her, and to the countless other women whose lives had been permanently derailed, those heavily guarded names represented something entirely different, something terrifyingly real. They represented the permanent theft of a stolen youth. They represented the profound, endless, paralyzing night terrors that still woke her up screaming in the pitch-black dark, her sheets soaked in a freezing sweat, her heart hammering violently against her ribs like a trapped bird desperately trying to escape its cage. Those missing protected names represented the permanent, incurable psychological scars that dictated exactly how she moved through the physical world every single day, the way she flinched at sudden loud noises, the way she constantly scanned every room she entered for a safe exit, the way she struggled to trust anyone, including herself. Furthermore, those names represented the agonizing, incredibly painful, decade-long pursuit of a legal justice that continually seemed to maliciously vanish into thin air right before it could ever be fully grasped by the desperate, exhausted victims who had sacrificed everything just to tell their stories. Yet as Virginia quietly, intensely, and heartbrokenly watched the highly theatrical, purely performative rage unfold on the glowing digital screen of her laptop, watching the powerful men in expensive, meticulously tailored suits shout violently over the sacred, fragile memory of abused girls, a chilling, absolute, and completely terrifying certainty began to settle deeply into the quiet, dark space of her modest living room. It did not arrive like a sudden lightning bolt, but rather like a slow, freezing fog creeping in under the doorframe, chilling her to the absolute bone. She realized with a profound, heartbreaking, and deeply cynical clarity that neither the calculated, cold senator demanding theatrical answers for the broadcast cameras, nor the combative, explosive director shouting loudly about the absolute truth for his devoted political base genuinely cared about her or anyone like her. They did not actually care, not even for a fraction of a second, about actually uncovering the dark, horrific, incredibly damaging reality hidden securely within those suppressed classified legal documents. They did not want the painful, uncomfortable truth. The truth was far too messy, far too dangerous, and involved far too many powerful people on their own respective sides of the political aisle. Instead, they only wanted the weaponized implication of the truth. They only wanted to use the terrifying shadow of the crimes to rapidly and effectively strike down their immediate political rivals in a televised display of manufactured dominance. They were absolutely not fighting for the forgotten girls whose lives had been left in absolute ruin. They were not fighting for true systemic accountability, nor were they actively trying to cleanse the deeply rotten American justice system of its deeply rooted, highly funded, institutionalized corruption. That would require actual courage, and neither man on that screen possessed an ounce of it. Instead, they were simply utilizing the deep, unresolved, bleeding pain of broken victims as a highly convenient, completely disposable, and incredibly effective political prop in a massive, multi-million-dollar performance art piece masquerading as congressional oversight. It was a sick, twisted, and incredibly lucrative show, explicitly and carefully designed strictly to generate maximum algorithmic engagement on social media platforms. It was a calculated spectacle designed to secure massive, untraceable, dark money political donations from enraged, terrified voters who were manipulated into believing that their $5 contribution would somehow stop the corruption. It was a perfectly choreographed dance meant to decisively win the incredibly fleeting 24-hour cable news cycle, allowing the politicians to declare a temporary victory before everyone entirely forgot about the hearing the very next morning, shifting their manufactured, exhausted anger onto the next manufactured, heavily promoted political outrage. When the short, explosive, highly edited, and heavily sensationalized video clip finally ended, the algorithm automatically and mindlessly transitioned the screen to another piece of loud, completely meaningless digital content. The profound tragedy of systemic human trafficking was instantly and jarringly replaced by a bright, flashing video regarding a trivial celebrity scandal, complete with upbeat music and laughing commentators. It was the ultimate, sickening insult to the gravity of what she had survived. Virginia did not cry. She was far too empty for tears. Slowly, with a heavy, profound exhaustion weighing down every single muscle in her body, she reached out her trembling, scarred hand. She felt the smooth, cold aluminum of the laptop lid under her fingertips, and she deliberately closed the device. The glowing screen went entirely dark. The closing of the laptop instantly cut off the noise, the fake, manufactured outrage, the endless political grandstanding, and the harsh, artificial light that had been casting long, ghostly shadows against her living room walls. The small, modest living room instantly plunged back into complete, uninterrupted, heavy, and oppressive silence. But this was not a peaceful silence. It was not the soothing, gentle silence of a well-deserved rest, the silence of profound healing, or the silence of a long-awaited resolution. It was the specific, heavy, suffocating, and entirely crushing silence of a profound, terrible, life-altering realization that would forever change how she viewed the country she lived in. She realized, sitting entirely alone in the dark, that the intricate, massive, highly funded machinery of American justice was not failing because it was accidentally broken. It was not failing because the agencies were understaffed, because the budgets were underfunded, or because the investigators were simply confused by the complexity of the international crimes. It was intentionally, maliciously, and perfectly failing. The system was operating exactly as it had been flawlessly designed to operate by the cynical, calculating architects who built it from the ground up. It was not a broken, rusted machine sputtering to a halt under the weight of its own incompetence. Rather, it was perfectly, efficiently failing to deliver any semblance of justice. This catastrophic failure occurred because the incredibly powerful individuals explicitly entrusted, solemnly sworn, and handsomely paid by the American public to operate and protect that very system were entirely, hopelessly distracted by their own insatiable, selfish ambitions. They were far too busy aggressively tearing each other apart for the cheap, temporary, incredibly hollow applause of the digital crowd, a faceless, ravenous audience that demanded endless outrage and offered nothing but fleeting dopamine in return. These elected officials were entirely consumed by the exhausting, endless task of building their own impenetrable political empires. Their days were not spent poring over heavily redacted case files or dedicating federal resources to tracking down international predators. Their valuable time was spent meticulously drafting sensationalized, fear-mongering fundraising emails specifically designed to panic their loyal donor bases. They were hyper-focused on securing their next lucrative primetime cable news interview, sitting comfortably in brightly lit makeup chairs while rehearsing their pre-written attack lines, constantly positioning themselves for the financial survival of their next heavily contested election cycle. They were deeply engaged in a completely bloodless, highly choreographed, heavily performative war with each other on the grand marble stage of Washington. By participating in this lucrative, carefully scripted theater, they were completely and deliberately ignoring the actual bloody, devastating war that had been relentlessly waged against innocent victims in the shadows for decades. And meanwhile, as the politicians shouted aggressively at each other in the bright, harsh lights of the Senate chamber, actively turning profound human tragedy into a highly profitable partisan circus, the true architects of the misery remained completely, utterly untouched. The incredibly powerful, incomprehensibly wealthy, historically untouchable names printed on that infamous, heavily guarded client list remained completely safe from any real, legal, or public scrutiny. They remain totally unnamed in the permanent historical record, their pristine public reputations entirely intact, their offshore bank accounts full and compounding daily interest. They were hidden comfortably away in the darkest, most secure, and most legally protected VIP shadows of the world. They were individuals of immense unchecked privilege, casually clinking crystal champagne glasses at exclusive private galas, hiding safely behind velvet ropes, ironclad non-disclosure agreements, and armed private security details, celebrating their absolute invulnerability while the world burned around them and the innocent lives they had callously ruined continued to smolder in the ash. The terrible, burning, agonizing question regarding the absolute, unfiltered truth of the list, the horrifying, world-shattering question of exactly who had bought, sold, and systematically destroyed human beings for their own twisted entertainment remained completely and totally wide open. It was definitively not a closed legal case neatly filed away in a dusty cabinet. It was a massive, gaping, unhealed psychological wound left bleeding quietly in the dark, entirely and deliberately forgotten by the very same hypocritical figures who had just spent 3 exhausting hours shouting about it on live national television. And as Virginia sat frozen in the suffocating, heavy silence of her modest suburban home, bathed only in the pale moonlight filtering through her living room window, she finally understood the most terrifying, soul-crushing truth of all. No one was coming to save them. There would be no grand reckoning. No one was coming, because the people holding the heavy keys to the federal vaults were precisely the ones profiting from the deafening silence.